Welcome, everyone. It's such a treat to have you with us tonight. My name is Emily Kramer-Gollenkoff, and I'm a co-founder of Emilys-Entourage, and we're so thrilled that you could join us. One quick housekeeping item. This session is being recorded and will be made available after the event. As many of you know, last summer, we conducted our first global survey designed to collect information about the health status, treatment needs, and clinical research preferences of those in the final 10% that don't benefit from currently available CFTR modulators, whether that's due to ineligible mutations, lack of access, or intolerable side effects. The survey was a huge success thanks to the CF community, CF advocacy organizations, and so many of you who so generously contributed and helped spread the word. We just recently published the results in Pediatric Pulmonology, and we made that article open access so that everyone could see and use the results, with huge thanks to Dr. Jennifer Taylor-Cousar. Tonight's webinar is in that same vein, to make the results accessible to all stakeholders in the CF community, to accelerate drug development, to improve clinical trials, to improve clinical care, to inform the regulatory review and approval process, and to provide insights into the lived experiences of those in the final 10% of the CF community. The purpose of tonight's webinar is to share key findings with you and have a question and answer session so that we can address any questions or comments that you have. So in terms of the agenda tonight, Dr. Jennifer Taylor-Cousar will present on the key survey results. Then we're going to open it up to questions from all of you. You can enter your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our very best to get to as many as we can. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to introduce yourself to one another using the chat feature. You can also be sure to take a quick look at our community guidelines, which will be posted in the chat. Then I'll close the evening with some brief remarks and announcements about upcoming events. Now, it is my supreme honor to introduce Dr. Jennifer Taylor-Cousar. She's a pediatric and adult pulmonologist, co-director of the Adult CF Program, and director of the CF Therapeutics Development Center, the adult program at National Jewish Health. She's a professor of the Departments of Medicine and Pediatrics and a member of EE's Scientific Advisory Board and a co-author of this article. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Taylor-Cousar.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here tonight. I want to make sure that everyone is aware that I am having the honor to present this data on behalf of all of the authors, which includes Emily, Liza, and Amanda. So these are my disclosures, most of which are related to the fact that I'm a primary investigator on many of our studies, and I consult on helping people to design clinical trials. But most relevant for this talk is the fact that I'm on the scientific advisory board for Emilys-Entourage, and the survey development and distribution were supported by Emilys-Entourage. So most of you are well aware that highly effective therapies that improve lung function and improve quality of life and decrease pulmonary exacerbations are available, at least by eligibility, because of people's CF mutations, for the majority of people with CF, about 90%. But not everyone is able to benefit. And why is that? Well, first, although average improvement is excellent, there is variability in response. On this slide, what I'm showing you is data from the phase 3 trial, the big trial that helped get the drugs approved from the study. It was published in the New England Journal. So on the left is the change in lung function, and on the right is change in sweat chloride. In purple are those people who were randomized to receive Alex-Tezaiva or Trikafta, Kaftrio in Europe. And on the y-axis is the number of patients for each of these. And then along the x-axis are buckets. And what I mean by buckets are places where people actually showed some improvement. So for example, if you look here in this grouping or bucket, the lung function improvement was less than 5 to 0%. And then in the next bucket is 0 to 5% improvement in lung function. Then all the way out here is an improvement of more than 30% in lung function. So you can see that there were some people who had no improvement and some people that had 30 and everything in between. And that also was true for sweat chloride. So the average improvement was really quite good, but there was high variability in the amount of improvement for different people with CF, and you can't predict who is going to have that great improvement. Another reason that it's not possible for every single person to benefit from modulators is because not everyone tolerates modulators. So in this figure, what I'm showing you is a number of people who either continued or discontinued the therapy during the trial. And on the x-axis is different trials. So the first one, for example, is those who were over 12 and had 1 copy of F508del and 1 of a minimal function mutation, one that you wouldn't expect to respond. And this is the other 12-year-old and older study for those who had 2 copies. And then this is looking at the open label study where everyone got to take the drug after they participated in the randomized trial. And finally, in those who were 6 to 11. So you can see in blue that the majority of people were able to take it, but not everybody, because some people, those in the orange boxes, discontinued. And we know in the real world, so outside of the clinical trial, that there are people who aren't able to tolerate modulator therapy for a number of reasons. And then finally is eligibility based on mutations. So of course, these drugs are targeted at certain mutations that cause certain protein problems. Schreiber and colleagues actually looked at F508del because, of course, the very first approvals were for people who had 2 copies of F508del or 1 copy of F508del and a minimal function mutation, but you had to have at least 1 copy of F508. So they looked at people with CF and they looked at them by race. So they looked at white, Hispanic, Black, Asian, and Native American people with CF, and they showed that while white people with CF were 10% of them didn't have 2 copies or didn't have any copies of F508del, the number of people who didn't have a copy of F508del who were Hispanic, Black, Asian, or Native American was much higher. And this sort of predicted what Susanna McCauley and Megan McGarry went on to show. They actually looked at the US CF patient registry and looked, regardless of age, at who was eligible for the modulators based only on their mutations. And they showed that 92% of people in the US CF patient registry were eligible for modulators, but only 76% of Hispanic and 70% of Black people were eligible. So essentially, people with CF from historically marginalized groups were less likely to qualify for modulators. But if you look overall, you hear 10% a lot, but really the number is 8% to 30% of people who aren't eligible based on their mutations. So we know that the registry can tell us a lot, like how many people qualify for modulators. But what the registry can't tell us is about how people who don't qualify or can't take modulators are feeling and what their concerns are, what their worries are, and whether or not they're going to be willing to participate in some of the really difficult, challenging studies that are going to be upcoming. Also, registries are usually confined to one country. So emilys-entourage decided that they really wanted to get the health perspectives of people with CF who were not able to benefit from modulators, and not just in the US, but all over the world. So really, they wanted to understand the demographics, the clinical characteristics, care perceptions, treatment needs, the mental health impacts of lack of access, and clinical research participation interest for those people who aren't benefiting from modulators. So they worked with various stakeholders, including the CF Foundation, the CF Foundation Community Voice, CFRI, and a family member of a person with CF, got all of that input and created this 38-question survey that was subsequently distributed all over the world. So it was an anonymous international survey that was distributed between June and July of 2021 via social media, including Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And it was also sent out via email to various stakeholders, including patient advocacy groups in the US, in Canada, in the UK, Europe, Australia, and Israel, and they asked that it be distributed to others as well. So what were the clinical characteristics of those who responded? So a total of 431 people responded. Then most of them didn't go past the initial question, or some of them didn't go past the initial questions, but we did have 375 people who answered additional questions. So the average age was about 18 to 44. That was the biggest group, although there were some children who responded. The gender, generally more females responded than males, or men than women. And then in terms of race, while the majority of people who responded were white, there were people who represented people who were American Indian and Alaska Native, Black African American, East and South Asian, Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, Middle Eastern and North African, and there were multiracial participants as well. While the majority of people were actually US participants, about 30% of the people who participated lived outside of the US. So what kind of clinical characteristics did they have? Baseline lung function was generally in the mild or moderate to severe range. So people's lung function ranged from 40 to 89%. We consider that to be moderate to severe disease, but there were people who had mild disease. So a percent predicted FEV1 greater than 90. And there were some who had very severe disease, FEV1 less than 40%. The most common complications that people reported were pulmonary exacerbations, sinus disease, CF-related diabetes and liver disease, as well as CF-related arthritis. And there were 24 participants who were status post lung transplant. The most common infections that people reported were Pseudomonas aeruginosa, methicillin-sensitive Staph aureus, then methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, and multi-drug resistant Pseudomonas. There were also participants who had Aspergillus and some who had non-tuberculous mycobacteria. People were also asked to report not only their CFTR mutations, but into which class their mutation fell. So as many of you are aware, class 1 mutations cause lack of production of the protein, lack of production of the chloride channel. So most people who participated said that they had class 1 mutations. And I put that star there because there were some people who said that they had other or didn't know, but they listed their mutations. And because of what we know from various databases, I was able to put them into some of the classes. So again, the majority of people who participated had class 1 mutations, those that don't respond to currently approved modulators. So we also asked whether or not people were using modulators, and if not, why not? So you can see that the majority of people, 64%, were not eligible for a modulator based on their CFTR mutations. There were 11% of people who were eligible but not taking a modulator, either because of lack of access or intolerance. Some answered don't know or not sure. There were some people who were not eligible for a modulator because of their transplant status, and there were some who were not eligible but were taking it off-label. And one of the things that I think is really, really important that was collected in this survey is the impact on life and mental health that people reported. So people were asked to rank the 4 most impacted aspects of life by CF, and 310 people answered this question. Mental health was the top at 45.5%, but plans for the future were a very close second at 45.2%. People also really said they were having an effect on their ability to spend time with friends and participate in social activities, and school issues such as taking medicines at school, missing school, having to miss appointments or miss school. Those issues were important to people and being impacted by CF. People were also asked to rank the top 4 most concerning aspects of CF to them. Not surprisingly, lung function issues were the highest at 76%, followed by bacterial colonization, GI and nutritional issues, and then mental and emotional health. I think it's also important to note that caregivers were asked the question as well, and 93.5% said that CF had a moderate to significant impact on daily life for them. And why is it having such an impact? Well, people with CF have a high burden of therapy. So most people were spending between 1 and 4 hours a day on their CF therapy. And there were some people who were even spending more than 4 hours a day on their therapy. There are also, importantly to note, were people who said that they were spending a lot of time in the hospital. So that more than half of people, and this isn't shown in this slide, but more than half of people said that they had spent 1 to 4 nights in the hospital because of a CF-related issue, and almost 14% said they had spent more than 5 nights in the hospital because of a CF-related issue. And this was even during the pandemic, when a lot of people were having to go to the hospital because they were staying home and masking all the time. When asked about the 4 most burdensome aspects of living with CF, these were the responses, and I thought it was important to show all of the responses here. So treatment burden and time required obviously were very high. Avoiding germs was really on people's minds. Feeling isolated or like a burden on others, 53.6% of people reported that they felt that way. Disruption of hospitalizations to daily life and obligations, fear of running out of treatments, ability to afford all the really expensive drugs that are required to maintain people with CF, obtaining and keeping their insurance, navigating legal issues, and then there were some other responses as well. So up to this point, we really focused on clinical characteristics and clinical impact. You know, people were also asked about how do you feel about participating in clinical research? And I think it's important to put it into the context of what studies may be coming down the pipeline. What are people going to be asked to do? So for those of you who haven't seen this image before, this is the CF therapeutics development pipeline. So all of the studies that are being supported by the CF Foundation, of course, emilys-entourage is also supporting studies, as are other organizations. But just to familiarize you with this, these are all of the therapies on top that are already approved and to patients. On the y-axis are the different phases in which the new drug is. So for example, things that are still in the lab versus things that are in phase 3 trials, which are the ones that we need to do to get FDA approval. And while we know that we're going to continue to need to develop therapies for the signs and symptoms of CF, so we want to improve mucociliary clearance, decrease inflammation and infection, and improve people's nutritional status, what people are really, really needing is a therapy that impacts the basic defect for them. And what that's going to require is gene therapy. And so these are highlighted in this purple box. And it's important to think about this issue because the gene therapy trials are going to be much more difficult, much more challenging to participate in because they're going to require lots of visits and long days. And so these are the kinds of trials that people are having to think about when they answer these questions. And for that reason, I also think it's important to think about the basic ethical principles that we use when we're thinking about research conduct, because it's going to be critical as we think about doing gene therapy trials. So the first principle is respect for persons. And what does that mean? So it means that individuals are treated as autonomous. In other words, they have to enter the research with enough information that they really are volunteering as a participant. They're not being forced to do it. They're not going into it not knowing what's going to happen. They really understand what's happening. And we need to make sure that vulnerable populations are protected. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. The next principle is beneficence, both to the individual participants and to society. And that means that we're not going to do any harm. We're going to try as much as we can not to cause people harm. We want to maximize the possible benefits from these trials. We also want to follow the principle of justice. So we want to make sure that there's an appropriate distribution of benefits and burdens. We don't want to overburden people who don't have a chance to benefit. And we have to keep in mind that injustice can appear in the selection of subjects because injustice arises from social, racial, sexual, and cultural biases that are institutionalized in our society. And we need to make sure that we are not contributing to that when we do our studies in CF for these really difficult trials that are coming down the line. So which populations are considered vulnerable? Vulnerable populations are those that require greater protection than average against the potential risks of participating in research. And I think most people usually jump to pregnant women, human fetuses, and neonates, so babies that were just born, people who are incarcerated, and kids. Those are obvious people who are vulnerable. But also we have to think about residents of facilities like nursing homes, those with debilitating mental health or cognitive impairment, and victims of traumatic events, which of course could include people with CF because some hospitalizations and some things that come up are very traumatic. But things I think that are really, really applicable to people with CF are individuals that aren't fluent in the language that's being studied, individuals who are economically disadvantaged, and individuals with a life-threatening illness or condition, of course, applies to all people with CF. So keeping in mind vulnerable populations, I think it's good to review some of the thoughts because people did have the opportunity to put in free text, in other words, just their thoughts about not benefiting from modulators. So one person said, each day is different. Some days are good and some days are bad, regardless of how consistent one is with their treatments. And I have no idea why the change. A parent said, the older my child becomes, the harder this disease becomes to manage physically and emotionally. It's extremely hard to watch as it slowly takes over. An adult said, I'm 42 and feel like I'm running out of time. My only CF issue is my lungs. My last call with my doc, he said, I wish I had a modulator for you. Same, doc, same. In regards to people who have modulators, one person said, we are happy for them, but worry we will be left behind and clinics and research priorities will reduce. Thinking of our child, we are devastated they will have to forge on alone. Another person said, I'm so glad so many have access to CFTR modulators, but at the same time, I'm concerned for my partner. I worry that 90% coverage could be seen as good enough, and I worry about the effect being passed over by these incredible drugs has on my partner's well-being, both physically and mentally. Finally, someone said, I feel like I've been holding my breath for the last 10 years. I'm always waiting for something to go wrong, for there to be bad news. I'm afraid to make plans for him, either short-term or long-term, and it would be amazing to not have that cloud hovering over our family. So parents with CF, partners of people with CF in the group who are not benefiting are experiencing trauma. They're feeling fear, they're feeling vulnerable. So it's really important to keep that in mind as we think about vulnerable populations and how we talk to people about participating in the upcoming trials. So when asked, people did actually say, about 77% of them, that they did want to participate in trials. But when asked why they hadn't or wouldn't participate, there were a number of responses, including lack of qualification, concerns about negative side effects or health deterioration, things that we can actually intervene upon, like travel distance to the study site and scheduling conflicts and time commitment. And something that's really important for anybody on the call who is a researcher, people are still not being asked. So it's critically important that we make sure that we're asking every single person who is eligible whether or not they want to participate. What features actually would motivate somebody to participate? People said that it was really important that drug access was going to be provided at the end of the trial. They also really wanted clinical trial design investigators to know that they wanted expanded inclusion criteria, including for those with low lung function and certain comorbidities. They wanted more trial sites to be added so they could access the option to participate. They wanted to be able to coordinate clinical trial appointments with their other medical appointments because of the time burden. They wanted remote testing options or visits that they could do instead of having to come to the trial site all the time. They wanted to make sure that there was going to be the provision of reimbursement or subsidies for the time it took to get to the site and the time missed from work. So why might someone participate in a clinical trial? Well, of course, not surprisingly, people said, well, they would participate because of the possibility of improving their own lung health. Also, because as we've heard in other situations, people with CF are often very altruistic. They want to help find the cure and help the CF community, even if it might not directly benefit them. They want earlier access to study drug, free access to new study drugs. They might participate because they've heard about positive results from a previous trial, because they get compensated for their participation. And some actually said that they get better care and attention from their care team, which I think that's something the care teams need to address, because we want people to have excellent care, whether or not they're participating in research. So in summary, highly effective treatment for the basic CF defect is potentially available for about 90% of people with CF. But ineligibility, intolerance, and lack of access prevent about 10% of people with CF from benefiting, keeping in mind that historically marginalized groups are overrepresented in this population. Those not benefiting from modulators are experiencing substantial physical and mental health impacts, both from their disease and from feeling left behind. The majority of people with CF not benefiting from modulators this time would participate in clinical trials, but there are caveats. We really need to have thoughtful consent for this vulnerable population, and trial design and study conduct must be done in partnership with all stakeholders, including people with CF and their families, in order to ensure that the development of highly effective therapies occurs for everyone. So with that, I'm going to stop and say thank you to all the people with CF and their families who participated in the survey. Also, those who provided guidance in survey development, including Siri Faith from CFRI, Enid Alish from Cystic-Fibrosis Foundation, Martin Moore, and the CF Foundation Community Voice. Also, those who helped with survey testing, including Laura Bonnell, Michelle Shore, Rebecca Cosgriff, Martin Moore, Aaron Moore, again, Siri Faith, Enid Alish, and Lucy Allen. So thank you to all of you for tuning in tonight, and I will turn it back over to Emily for some questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor-Cousar. Now, we would love to address questions from all of you. So if you haven't already submitted your question, you can still do so now in the Q&A box on the bottom. And so I think we're going to get started with a question. Jen, this is for you. So what is the status of genetic research?
So that's a great question, actually, especially because there was a press release just 2 days ago stating that the first person had successfully been dosed in the most recent trial of what we call an adeno-associated virus, way to transfer a corrected gene into the people's lungs with CF. So we have lots of gene therapies that are coming down the pipeline. Some of those are going to be therapies that have the message for the correct protein, and some are going to be the whole gene. Another thing that we're going to consider down the line when we have the technology to do it is gene editing, but those trials are still many years away. The difficulty with gene therapy is that you have to get enough of the corrected gene into the cells, and you can imagine that in people with CF, when they have really thick, sticky mucus, it's harder to get into the cells. We do now have CF animal models that will allow us to possibly test some of these therapies, but the difficulty there is that think about how you as a person can relatively easily get COVID if you're not vaccinated, but it's much harder for your cat, for example, or your dog to get it. So every virus looks a little bit differently at the way it can attach to cells, and those are different between species. So if we test it in an animal model, that virus may not affect the animal in the same way that it affects the person. So we are doing really well. Again, we just dosed somebody with the first gene therapy in very many years after failed trials in the past, but we are kind of far away still from gene editing. I hope that answers the question, because there are these range of things for gene therapy.
That's great. Thanks, Jen. So next question is, what does the next survey look like? And I can actually answer this one. So we are actually working on the 2022 survey. We were so thrilled with the results from the 2021 one, and it clearly provided value to the community. And so we're back at it. We're developing questions for the 2022 survey. It's going to come out this summer. It's going to be very similar to this past year's survey with some additional questions. And actually just yesterday, I believe, we launched an open submission period, because we also want to hear from all of you. So we'd love to hear your suggestions of questions that we could answer or information that we could gather in the survey. We can't guarantee that we will ask them all, but we would really love for you to submit questions. And so they're actually going to post a link to that survey, and anyone from the CF community can participate. We'd really love to hear from you. Next question is for you. So what surprised you most about the survey findings?
That's a great question. I think the thing that surprised me most was, I sort of knew from Alexander Quittner's study that the depression, anxiety rates are higher in people with CF. And I sort of had a sense that people with CF and their families were stressed about the fact that there were people who were eligible for modulators and they weren't. But it really came through. Again, I use the word trauma, and I really feel like, having read some of the responses, that people are experiencing medical trauma from not being able to access these therapies, even though people are really happy for their friends who have these drugs, or their family members who actually respond to the drugs, even if they don't. People's mental health is really being impacted, not just by their CF, but by the fact that they don't have access to therapies that most people have. They feel left behind.
Great. What are you most excited about for nonsense mutations?
Well, that's a really good question. I think the thing I'm most excited about is not actually quite yet gene therapy, but the data that came out recently from ELOX that showed that if you added a modulator in cells to their drug, which helps nonsense mutations, of course, the cell is told, stop making the protein. You don't need to keep doing that by this stop mutation. And the ELOX drug actually says, hey, ignore that and keep going, make the protein. But what we saw, for example, with lumacaftor, ivacaftor, or Cambi for F508, it wasn't enough just to give the corrector, but you also had to get the potentiator. So you had to get the protein to the top of the cell and then make it work better with that ivacaftor once it was there. And so from the in vitro data, it looks like if you tell the cell keep making the protein, it wasn't quite enough, but in vitro, at least if you added ivacaftor to make it work better, it looked really good. And so there's now going to be an expansion of the ELOX trial, so people will get not only the ELOX drug, but a modulator, ivacaftor, to see if that actually helps them improve their lung function. And that, I think, is very exciting.
And I'll just add a little bit onto that from a patient perspective, which is that I feel like there are more emerging promising therapies in all variety of different therapeutic areas than there have ever been before. And that's really what gives me the most hope, is that we are shooting from all directions and things are really advancing. They're advancing through the clinical trial phases. They're advancing from translational and basic research to clinical research. And so it feels like there are there are the read-through agents, there are, some of the mRNA agents, there are gene therapies, there are gene editing, like things are starting to happen. And I know so many of you probably can share the same sentiment that, it feels like finally things are starting to happen. But that that's what gives me the most hope for nonsense mutations, just all the different therapeutic approaches that are advancing. The next question, so how do these findings compare or differ from data collected around the larger CF community?
So that's a good question. Really, this survey is the first to really just focus on people with CF who aren't benefiting from modulators. Now, in terms of publication, the CF Foundation has been using community voice to ask sort of similar questions, but this is the first survey that's looked across the world at different populations of people who don't have access to modulators, aren't tolerating modulators, or don't qualify. So I think that's how this survey is different.
That's great.
I don't know if you want to add anything. Sorry, Emily. Do you want to add anything to that? Okay.
No, I think that's great. So does the survey include feedback from physicians and nurses? What do they hear as they treat CF patients, and what are their pain points, the pain points that they're hearing?
So this was really directed at people with CF and their families who are benefiting from modulators. There were, again, 431 people who responded, but then around 375 who continued. And I believe that some of that is because a few people were researchers or somehow other related to people with CF, but not a family member or a partner. So we don't actually have that perspective in the survey. But in terms of what we're hearing, I think it is similar to what the survey reported. I think that people, because it was an anonymous survey, were more blunt in their free text responses than they are with us in clinic. And so I think that's why I, really emphasize that people are experiencing medical trauma, because I sort of had that sense from talking to people. But again, I think people were a lot more blunt in the survey because it was anonymous than they are. Because I know from reading the literature and from personal experience that when people with CF and other people who come to see doctors, they don't want to disappoint their doctor or make their doctor or their nurse or their other team member feel badly. And so I think that sometimes people aren't as honest with us about how much they're suffering as they were willing to reveal in the survey.
Yeah, and I think also what came through really, those were just a sampling of responses, but what came through really loud and clear is just this incredible fear of being left behind. And I think that came through clearly in the sample that we shared, but it was really profound. We were, in tears reading all these responses because it was really heavy and very relatable personally, but people felt real fear that like the community was going to sort of be happy with 90% and just sort of move on, and that the same commitment and focus that we've seen over the past few years and decades was going to sort of fade. So that was really pretty profound. I see, a couple other questions came in. So how can more people with nonsense mutations find out about trials?
Great question. So some of the CF centers actually have websites about studies that are happening at their sites, but there's also two other great resources. One is the CF Foundation has a clinical trial finder where you can check boxes like, here's my age, and here are my mutations, and here are the bacteria that I chronically have infections with. And it'll show you which trials are being done for that. And they'll even show you, if you check off the box, how close they are to you. Also, is a little bit more dense, but there's something called clintrials.gov. And you can go on clintrials.gov and look for all the trials that are currently enrolling for cystic fibrosis. And I can put those in the chat.
And I'll also add on there. So emilys-entourage also has a patient registry for individuals with 1 or 2 copies of a nonsense mutation. So if you, add your name or your child's name to that registry, we will notify you of any clinical trials or studies that we're working on. We partner with different companies to help recruit potentially eligible individuals for those trials. And so that can be a really fast way to learn about those. And all of that information comes directly to you rather than going through your clinic, so that you can really be the ultimate decision maker and there's no gatekeepers in between trial opportunities and you. The next question is, how promising is research for mRNA and gene therapy for CF? How many years off are we from a working drug? 3 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, 10 to 20 years, or 20 plus years?
Oh my gosh, I wish I had a crystal ball to tell you the answer to that question. I think all of us have been anticipating the day when we can start these trials again. So for those of you who are younger or may not be aware of the history, so back in 1989, when the CFTR gene was discovered, people were sure that gene therapy was just around the corner. There was so much excitement and hope. And then it turned out, as we now know, that it's really difficult, as I mentioned earlier, to get a corrected gene into the lungs of someone with CF. And you have to worry about the immune response if you're using a virus to help get the gene in. There were just a lot of factors that prevented it from happening. And then outside of CF, unfortunately, someone actually died from gene therapy. And so that sort of really put a halt to a lot of it, because people said, we need to go back to the drawing board and we need to figure out, one, how to make sure we're doing these trials safely, but also how to make them more efficacious. So going back to those principles of research conduct that I talked about, and making sure that the risks don't outweigh the possible benefits. And then the UK, while we were really focusing on modulators, the UK was really focusing on gene therapy. And they did another big trial after they tried something else using a liposome. So basically putting it in sort of kind of like a fat molecule and getting it into cells instead of using a virus, because there was lower risk for an inflammatory response. And then they did that trial for a year and it didn't show enough benefit, even though it was safe. So it's been really, really challenging, and we had to develop new technology to really find a way that we think it'll be more effective. So that's a really long answer, but I'm excited about the fact that we have, as you said, Emily, multiple companies, which means lots and lots of brains are thinking about this issue and how to improve the technology so that we can get this done. So we just got back from the CF Therapeutics Development Network meeting last night, and Tony Domerwitz from who used to work for the Federal Drug Administration and now works for the CFF, was talking about how quickly you might get a therapy that is shown to be efficacious into the clinics. And we think that if something's really safe and efficacious, that it will be fast-tracked again. So from those early trials, we'll be able to move to approvals, kind of like we did with modulators, if something is really safe and effective.
Great. So can we also talk about what we're seeing with therapies focused on splice mutations, such as splicens?
So wait, rephrase that one again. So I was reading a question in the chat.
Sure. Could we also talk about what we're seeing with the therapies that are focused on splice mutations, such as splicens?
So that's another one that is being funded by multiple different organizations, and they're not quite yet ready for clinical trials, but they're getting very, very close. So all of these are going to help those people who are in the 10% or so of people who aren't benefiting from modulators.
Great. Someone wants to know how to sign up for ELOX trials.
So again, from either, I put in the cff.org trial finder. So if you go into the trial finder and you search for ELOX trials, you can actually go to that page. It'll take you to that page, and then it'll give you the list of the sites who are conducting the trial. And then if you go to that site, then you can contact the research coordinator directly by following the link. And that way you can start to correspond with them about whether or not you'd be eligible for the trial.
So someone asked, given the feedback pointing at trauma, would a psychologist be involved with posing the questions in the next survey? And I can take this one, which is, we see our role as revealing the issues, gathering the information, and sort of shedding light on what they are. And then I think, it becomes the responsibility of the whole CF community to figure out how to treat it. And so, I think they're clearly, the point that Dr. Taylor-Cousar mentioned around trauma is really, really on point and really significant. I think there are unmet needs. And so we really see our role as shining a light on that unmet need, so the larger CF community can put our heads together about how best to address that. Anything else that you'd want to add to that?
No, I think that's spot on.
Next question, what are the biggest barriers to treating the remaining 10% of people with CF?
So I think there are a number of barriers. So one is access. So we're really lucky in the US where the FDA will approve the expansion of labels for approved drugs based on in vitro data. So for example, when there are people who qualify who have a really, really rare mutation, the US Federal Drug Administration will say, if you can show in cells that it works, then we'll allow you to give it to people with those mutations. And we're the only country where that's happening. Obviously, there are also lots of countries where access to even things like pulmozyme and Toby isn't happening. And so they certainly don't have access to the modulators. So there's one issue. I think that we don't have enough people who have been asked to participate in trials. So there's a whole group of people who would probably qualify and maybe willing to be in trials who have not yet been asked, and that's a barrier. And there are some people who have major barriers to participating, whether it's transportation or language. And we, as a research community, need to address those barriers to make sure that everyone has access to being able to participate in a clinical trial, especially because, as some of the participants pointed out, if you participate in a trial, you often have earlier access than everybody else does to the drug. I mean, the other big barrier is just finding drugs that actually work for nonsense mutations or regardless of what mutations you have. So there are a number of barriers that we have to address still as a CF research community. I don't know if you can think of any other ones, Emily, that come to mind as somebody with CF.
Yeah, I mean, I think access, eligible mutations. I think you hit them all. So one other question here is about what work, can you talk about work on antibiotic resistance?
Yeah, that's another really great question. So the CF community has spoken loudly and clearly that they're really concerned about infections, and we saw that in the survey as well. And recently, the CF Foundation has used a large sum of the money that they brought in when they sold the drugs that they helped develop through Vertex, and they're investing it in infection research. So obviously, lots and lots of companies are now looking at phage, which would help with that to some degree. We are looking at companies who can develop new antibiotics as well. So it's really, really an important topic to people with CF, and important for those of you who are waiting for a therapy that affects the basic defect. So that's definitely being invested in by multiple different organizations and different companies.
Great. And I actually had some additional thoughts I want to go back to about the barriers question. So
Okay.
Two other things came to mind for me. So I think what the two really significant barriers when you're dealing with rare mutations of a rare disease is clinical trial recruitment. So, gathering the community, convening the people to participate in the trial often significantly delays clinical trials. So not, a little plug, I guess, for our patient registry, but truly having a ready-made community that significantly accelerates the drug development process. That's one thing. The second thing is also building relationships and educating regulators about the unmet needs. And so that's another thing that we are working really hard on at emilys-entourage. We had a patient listening session back in July that was incredibly successful, and we're really using that as a launch pad to further our relationship with regulators and make it crystal clear to them how urgent the needs are for those in the remaining in the final 10%, and even more broadly than that in the whole CF community. And so, but I think that that piece can also be a big barrier. We were really fortunate in the development of the CFTR modulators, thanks to so many in the CF community, that review and approval happens so quickly. And so we're really hoping to be able to support a similar process as appropriate for future therapies as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I actually, as you were speaking, it made me think about the fact that I think one of the recent barriers actually over the last few years, unfortunately, is people's distrust, because you sort of alluded to trust, but there's a lot of distrust of science, not, I think, as much in the CF community as in some other communities, but that's another, I think, barrier, especially when you're talking about gene therapy. So it really is upon us to try to educate the CF community. That means the doctors and the nurses and the researchers and people with CF and their families about these new therapies and what the risks and benefits are. I mean, I didn't list all the specific problems with developing a gene therapy, but those are there. And also, as you talk about the population, it's a small population. Like you said, it's an orphan disease to start out with, and you're talking about a small population within that small population. And so one of the things that we talked about as researchers is how we can increase communication with sites around us to help facilitate the referral of people. Like, so if your site's not doing a trial, then you know the site in another state that is close to you is doing the trial, making sure that you are talking to each other so that you can help that person not have to navigate taking care of their CF and all the travel and everything else, and the communication part. So it really means the research community needs to work on that aspect of this issue.
That's true. And also, you know, the one last thing that comes to mind is also collectively as a community combating the larger misperception among the broader community that CF has done. And I think that really is a significant thing incumbent on all of us is to really make it, you know, very clear that it is far from done and that there's still a lot of work to do, and to use our voices and our stories to bring that to life for people in really personal ways.
Yes, exactly.
Great. So I think we have time for one final question, which is, how can someone whose mutations, both mutations, are so rare they are not on any list, be able to join a trial or be tested to be on a modulator?
So in terms of the modulators, they're really working right now to look for more and more mutations that are responsive to modulators. And I say they, I mean both those who, like Vertex, who have a drug lab, and those like the CF Foundation who, you know, don't have a specific drug that they want to test. They want to test all drugs that are possibly going to work. So those drugs are being tested against cells that have rare mutations. So one of the things I think that's really important is for people with those really rare mutations to participate in the studies like RARE, where they collect your nasal cells and then test them against known modulators and the modulators that may be looked into in the future. So getting your cells added to these databases will help you and other people with those really rare mutations so they can be tested against known modulators.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for such great questions. For any questions that we couldn't get to that were submitted ahead of time or that we missed on the chat, we're going to do our very best to answer them after today's webinar and post them on the EE blog. And so we're going to post a link to sign up for the EE blog in the chat so that you can be made aware of those whenever we publish the blog post. So before we close out for the evening, I just want to mention a few things, and some of these have come up already, but just want to give a few more details on them. So given, as I mentioned before, given the success of last year's survey, we've decided to make the survey annual. We want to ensure that we're collecting information that's valuable for all stakeholders in the CF community. And so we launched an open submission period so that you can submit any questions that you think we should consider including. It's open to anyone in the CF community, people with CF, families of people with CF, clinicians, researchers, regulators, biopharmaceutical companies, you name it. Anyone can submit questions, and we really encourage you to do so. The submission period will remain open until Tuesday, April 19th at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. And to submit questions, you can just complete our open submission period survey, which is going to be posted in the chat. We also encourage you to share it with anyone that you think might be interested or appropriate to submit it as well. Following that, we'll also be releasing our 2022 survey this summer. We'll again be making all results publicly available. And similar to this year, your participation and help spreading the word is going to be critical to the survey success. So please keep your eyes peeled for that survey in the next few months. I mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. our patient registry. So, clinical trial recruitment continues to be a significant barrier to speeding drug development, especially in rare diseases and ultra rare mutations. Emilys-Entourage maintains a registry of individuals with 1 or 2 copies of a CF nonsense mutation. We work with sponsors and investigators to connect potentially eligible individuals with CF to relevant clinical trials. So if you or your child has 1 or 2 copies of a CF nonsense mutation, we encourage you to consider signing up for EE's patient registry, and we'll post a link in the chat right now. I just want to note that the privacy of this data is of critical importance to us at Emilys-Entourage. We do not share any personal registry data with companies or researchers. We always serve as the brokers and send all the communication directly from us. I also want to briefly share with you about our Cure Finders or CF Crew program. Some of you may already know about this, but it is a way for the CF community to come together and use your voice and network to raise money to support Emilys-Entourage's research mission. We make it incredibly easy for you. So we set up a customizable fundraising page. We provide templates for email and social media. We're going to be launching our next group in the coming months, and we'd love for you to consider participating. If you're interested in learning more, we're going to post a link in the chat and you can read more about it. And if you're interested in participating, you can email us at events@emilys-entourage.org. And we're going to also post that email address in the chat. So whether you or your family member is part of the 10% or part of the 90%, this is an incredibly powerful way to use your voice and your story to advance drug development and drive change, and to show solidarity and commitment to the CF community to accelerating breakthroughs for 100% of the CF community with no one left behind. Finally, if you want to stay abreast of all the latest at Emilys-Entourage, you can sign up for updates. Again, a link in the chat to do that, and we promise we won't spam you. We're very deliberate about our emails. So as we close for the evening, I just want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. I want to give an extra big shout out to Dr. Jennifer Taylor-Cousar, to my co-authors, my mom, Liza Kramer, and Amanda Camacho, and especially to those of you who so generously participated in the study, spread the word, and helped guide us and help develop the survey. It truly takes an entourage, and we have the very best one. I also want to say thanks to the Emilys-Entourage staff for helping put together this webinar tonight. Our sincere hope is that this data can help inform drug development, clinical trial design, clinical care and support programs, and regulatory reviews and approvals, and ultimately bring about critical advances for those in the final 10%. As we all know, they can't possibly come soon enough. On behalf of Emilys-Entourage, thank you for your commitment and your hard work to make that future a reality ASAP. Thank you so much and have a good night.